surprised the world at Glasgow last week by committing to a lot more than was expected at the COP26. India said that we would go net zero carbon emissions by 2070. Earlier, it was believed that we would not commit to any net zero carbon emission deadline. We have increased our target for renewable energy or non-fossil fuel energy to 500 megawatts by 2030 from the 450 megawatts earlier, and have said all of the things that were needed to be said at a forum like this. But how easy or difficult is it going to be to translate this into reality? India is currently the third largest emitter. It is highly dependent on thermal-based energy and coal-based energy. Almost 70% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. And the movement to go solar or hydro has been on for a while, but has been working in bits and pieces. To really deliver what we promised at Glasgow, we will have to ditch coal in a much larger fashion. Will we be able to do that? Speaking to us on that now today is Sumant Sinha. He's CMD of Renew Power, one of India's foremost companies working in the space of renewable energy. He was also present at Glasgow and spoke at this very, very important conference. Mr. Sinha, thank you so much for speaking with us on the India development debate. Let me begin by just getting your take on the commitments that were announced by Prime Minister Modi at Glasgow.
Tamanna, thank you so much for having me. Look, Glasgow was very exciting. Of course, the whole conference is still going on, but the few days that I spent there were very interesting because there was a real buzz in terms of a lot of conversations, a lot of world leaders, of course. More interestingly, a lot of corporates were there as well, and we'll talk about that later. As far as Prime Minister Modi's presence there was concerned, he was there for 2 days, but he made a pretty big impact. The announcements he made were, some were things that he talked about earlier, some things were new. Among the new things were basically that, number one, he talked about a net zero, which was the big daddy of the commitments, because that was the first time India had actually put the concept of net zero on the table. The date for that was 2070, which a number of people might argue it's very far out. It's 50 years from now. But nevertheless, the fact that it was put on the table means that there can be discussion around it now. And I think that itself was a very big, in principle, move forward from India. So I think that was number one. The second thing that Prime Minister Modi also announced was the fact that the carbon intensity of GDP would go down by 45% by 2030, rather than the earlier commitment of 30 to 35%. So that was a pretty big step forward as well. And the third thing he said, which was also new, was that in addition to whatever the trajectory would be that India would be on between now and 2030, there would be an additional 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide that India would offset in addition to that. And that would be an additional 3% bending down of India's carbon dioxide trajectory. I think that's very significant as well, because it gives a commitment over and above whatever the Prime Minister had talked about earlier. So I think in these three respects, at least, there was very significant forward movement on the part of the Indian government. The couple of other announcements, the first one around renewable energy, is something that the government had announced earlier. So there was, that was really a restatement of that announcement. So I think primarily those are the key announcements. But I think it was a very significant step forward, as I said, on the part of the Indian government, and I think shows the government's intent to be a leader in dealing with climate change rather than being on the back foot.
So let's talk about now implementation, and let's start with 500 megawatts by 2030 of renewable energy. Can we reach that goal? I believe that we may come up short of our goal in 2022 as well. What are the challenges you see here?
Yeah, so, the 500 gigawatts target for non-fossil fuels is really the 450 gigawatt target that we had earlier for renewables, and add in the hydro and the nuclear and basically get to about 500 gigawatts. So it's basically the same target that we had earlier as well. Now, as far as the issue of whether we'll achieve it or not is concerned, my view is that we actually will achieve it. And the reason is that if you look at power demand growth in India, at 5 or 6% every year. And keep in mind that we're now back to pre-COVID levels plus almost 8 or 9%. So power demand has been very robust during this time period, even through COVID. If we keep growing at that level, and as the Indian economy grows, there's no doubt in my mind that we will grow at 5 to 6%. Then most of that new capacity is now being met through renewables because nobody wants to invest any longer in coal-based assets, at least in new coal-based plants. Existing plants that are already in the works will probably carry forward. But that is not going to be sufficient by any means to meet this new capacity growth or demand growth. And that demand growth will have to be met from renewables now. And so if we just do a simple extrapolation, to meet India's demand requirements, we will need to have 450 to 500 gigawatts of renewables. And therefore, eventually, right now, of course, power demand is still coming up for the DISCOMs. We will then, have the target being met eventually. Now, there are, of course, going to be bumps in the road as well, not least of which is the issue of DISCOMs in India. DISCOMs are, one of the big unreformed sectors of the Indian economy. It's a tough one for the central government because it sits in the hands of the state governments. State governments have been very relaxed and sort of not relaxed, but lax about essentially moving forward with privatizing or demonopolizing or delicensing the distribution sector. Unfortunately, power pricing in India is still treated by politicians as something that they have to control. And unless they move away from that, the distribution sector is not going to get resolved. And that will ultimately be the single biggest potential roadblock in the rollout of renewables.
The other question is that why haven't we been able to move forward at the pace probably we could on widespread adoption of renewable energy? Is part of it because of high costs of everything you need to make it happen? We still import a lot from China, solar batteries, panels, etc. And that hiccup still remains despite several decades. Is that an issue you see?
No, I don't see that as an issue, Tamanna. I think that you're absolutely right that solar panels were almost entirely imported from China, still are. But the government has now decided that they want to manufacture most of the equipment for renewables in India. And therefore, they've imposed very significant customs duties on the imports of modules from outside of India. And they've also come out of the manufacturing linked incentive scheme to encourage manufacturing in the country. So yes, there might be disruption for a year or 2 years while this transition takes place from imports to domestic modules, but that will get sorted out. There's a lot of interest in setting up capacity in the country. And so you will see us transitioning from imported modules to domestic modules, I think, over the next 2-3 years. And so I don't think that's going to be a constraining factor. As far as wind turbines are concerned, all wind turbines are right now manufactured in India itself. So we have a pretty domestic indigenous industry for renewable energy equipment manufacturing. And I'm pretty sure that batteries also eventually will get manufactured in the country. So I don't see that as being a constraint. Yes, there will be, as I said, a transition period of a couple of years. But eventually, by 2030, I would say the large bulk of the equipment would be Indian manufactured. I think that is going to be very positive because, India is a very big market. It's one of the largest 2 or 3 markets in the world. And so if we can meet that market demand through Indian equipment, then that Indian equipment will actually have a large market to sell into and can eventually bring costs down and also become an exporter out of India for renewable energy equipment. Now, why that is important is because today the supply chain of choice of default is China. And, almost everybody in the world relies on Chinese imports. And that's not a very healthy dependence for us to have as a country. And so therefore, moving to having India as an alternative supplier, I think is a very, very robust strategy on the part of the government, actually.
The other big question mark, in a sense, over the whole clean energy movement came about a few weeks ago when the world was undergoing an energy crisis, right from Europe to China to India, where a lot of commentators felt that renewable energy was not able to keep up with the surge in demand we saw post-COVID pandemic and when people started, consuming more and moving more. Do you think that was a bit of a pushback to the idea that we can sustain ourselves with non-coal-based energy?
No, Tamanna, I don't think you can read really any definitive conclusion from the recent coal crisis or the power crisis. Look, today renewables is still at a very early stage in the grid. We only account for about 10 or 11% of total power supplied in the grid. And so therefore, shortfalls of demand and supply are happening more because of what's happening on the coal side than what is happening on the renewable side. Now, again, there is a transition period. And, for renewables to go from 10% to 50% is going to take time. And I think we have to cross that hump rapidly. And the faster we do it, the better it is, because in the interim, you will have demand supply mismatches like this as coal starts getting bound down, renewables starts increasing, storage, new storage technology starts coming in. So you will have potentially temporary mismatches like this, which is why it's very important for us to manage the grid in a much, much smarter and sophisticated manner than we are currently doing it. And that is really where states need to really, really play ball. Because if they don't invest in the distribution and transmission infrastructure, because unfortunately electricity in India is a concurrent subject, and so state level activities sit within the state ambit, if they don't invest, it is going to lead to these kinds of problems. Now, in India right now, there is sufficient coal capacity still because a lot of coal plants not being properly utilized. The problem was we had a coal crisis because of rains and this, that, and the other. And so it was more of a coal supply chain crisis than it was really not having enough power generating capacity on the thermal side. Now, that was also very temporary in nature because of the extended monsoon and so on. That got addressed literally within a couple of months or so, or in fact, even less. So I think as long as there's sufficient balancing capacity in the grid, as long as the grid is managed in a flexible way, I don't think there will be a problem as the percentage of renewables ramps up. If anything, we need to ramp it up much faster and build that flexibility in the grid. And that's where states and the central government need to really come onto the same page.
But some of some of the headwinds you're describing are endemic ones, and which is why it brings me back to the question of, can we really change, can we really do it? You mentioned electricity is a concurrent subject. It's also a very political subject. Free power to different segments of society is one of the freebies doled out before every major election and continues to be so. How then are we going to find a lucrative, sustainable system to move to renewable energy? Who will pay for it?
So you're absolutely right, Tamanna. So there are 3 different parts to your statement. So let me try to take them one by one. So the first thing you mentioned is that power, unfortunately, is a very political subject in India. And that's a real tragedy, actually, for the Indian consumer more than anybody else. And the reason is that if you look at, for example, oil prices, they are freed up. If they go up and down, yes, there is the occasional, there are articles in newspapers and so on. But fundamentally, people realize that it's not being done by the government any longer. Telecom prices set by power, by private companies. There's so many other public goods where the pricing is set by the markets, not by the politicians. I don't know why power should be any different. Power is only 20% of the entire energy basket. Why should that one sector be subject to political control and not any other part of the energy sector? It actually baffles me. And this whole notion about the fact that you have to give freebies to the agricultural sector or the retail consumer, I think it's something that is leading to massive underinvestment in the distribution sector, which is ultimately impacting quality of supply to all customers in India, is keeping power prices very high for industrial and commercial customers, which is making their industries unviable, which is one of the reasons why India is a high-cost location to manufacture it, because our power prices are high. So these are things that need to be addressed with a high degree of urgency, and there needs to be much stronger conversation within civil society that this whole power pricing aspect needs to be taken out from politicians. But politicians are loath to, unfortunately, give it up. So that's, I think, one of the big issues. The second issue is that renewables is no longer expensive. It is much cheaper than coal-based power. And so, in fact, any distribution utility that wants to go into making their power supply cheaper will actually go for renewables. Now, the only thing is, along with renewables, you have to manage the intermittency of it, which means you have to invest in flexibility of the grid. You have to invest in digital and software to make the grid more flexible. You have to invest in smart meters. So you have to do a lot of these things, which actually will make the grid a lot more modern and flexible. And you have to invest in those kinds of things ahead of time. Otherwise, you will run into these kinds of issues. Now, again, this is where states have a very, very important role to play. They have to make those investments happen. And if they don't, we will continue to have these kinds of problems that we're having right now. But fundamentally, power needs to be deregulated. It cannot be a regulated sector any longer if we really want the kind of growth that we're looking for.
You know, I want to know how you are looking at India's promises for renewable energy and our outlook to climate change right now from your own vantage point. You have been at the forefront of the renewable energy movement per se, and one of the key corporates driving it. There are a lot of others who've come in right now, including Reliance. Adani, of course, has been there for some time. Do you think this is the inflection point when the private sector in all seriousness is coming in, and maybe this could cause the change?
I think so, Tamanna. And I think there are 2-3 reasons why this inflection point is now upon us. Number one is the fact that over the last couple of years, renewables have become cheaper than conventional power. And I think that recognition has finally set in, which is why large corporates like an NTPC, Tata Power, Adani Green, the Reliance Group are all now thinking about getting in because they realize that renewables is the future within the overall power sector, and more broadly, now with green hydrogen becoming a more likely possibility also in the broader energy sector. And as I said earlier, keep in mind that electricity accounts for only about a quarter of the total energy basket. But through hydrogen, you have the ability of going from electricity into energy and really expanding the size of the market. So therefore, that has really caused the inflection point to happen. The second thing I think also is that the whole climate change issue has become a lot more center stage now. And especially in India, the consequences of pollution and so on are also linked to some extent to the fact that we have dirty power that is being produced. So there is a change there. The third change that is happening is globally investors are now beginning to put a lot of pressure on corporates with respect to cleaning up their own act, making sure that they are buying clean energy, that their whole supply chains and their whole operations are much more sustainable in nature. So there's a lot of pressure coming from investors as well. And we are seeing that because we're talking to some of these companies. So for all of these reasons, there is now a tipping point that is happening that is now going to lead to much more substantive growth in renewable energy going forward. And that is why I'm pretty confident that the 500 gigawatt target will end up being achieved because you have a lot more players coming in. The government realizes that renewables is clearly the way forward. And therefore, the whole system is going to be changing. And even the sort of financiers also recognize that. So I think we've crossed the tipping point now. And the whole energy systems and the whole power systems, you will see will grow in a very different way going forward now, which is something that we've been talking about for a very long time. It's really good to see it happening now.
For the best. Yes.
Absolutely.
We've been talking about it for a very long time. Another thing we've been talking about for a long time and already seeing is the impact of climate change with erratic weather patterns across the country, and which is really harming people. So more power to the movement for renewable energy, and thank you so much, Mr. Sinha, for joining us today to outline your vision.